and welcome to our second IB history video. Today we are going to be exploring history of the Americas, Civil War. This is going to be specifically for the first exam that we've had, but obviously it will be relevant as I think this will cover most, if not all, of the content in the Civil War category of the History of Americas section of our IB history exam. Again, if you don't know the sections of your IB history exam and you are curious as to what those will look like, I have posted a previous video talking about them, and that would be helpful for you to go ahead and look at because it talks about these pieces in detail and could help you better understand what you're looking at. And just if you didn't watch that video, if you are not taking IB History HL, you don't need to know this, so go learn something worth your time. All right, without further ado, let's talk about this exam. So in front of me here, I've got the Civil War mock exam study guide. I have a list of people who I will not be mentioning because I don't like talking about people. You'll notice that the list repeats sometimes. For example, James K. Polk and James K. Polk, who is definitely supposed to be James K. Polk because there's no Polk in history. So the other thing that I realized when I went to film this first time is that I naively believed that the list would be in order of the history how it happened. This isn't true at all. So this will be interesting. I did pull up some pictures to look at. I also pulled up some political cartoons. I think it's important that I say before we get started. The political cartoons I've pulled up are examples of documents that you could see on your mock exam. You will likely not see them on the actual exam because the actual exam for us will be focused on the move to global war. So those documents will be more related to Japan, Germany, Italy. They won't be America, basically, is what I'm trying to tell you. But for the mock exam that we'll be taking on Wednesday, these will be important to look at because these are things you could see. These political cartoons, however, don't represent my beliefs or my opinions. They're just pretty much the first cartoon that pops up when you Google it. I thought that those were common enough that they would be good to look at before this exam. All right. So the first few things here I generally know, but as we move down the list, I will know less and less of it until we hit the point where we actually started covering the information in class. I probably won't be covering all of these topics simply because I don't care, and neither should you. Because of the style of the the IB exam, you won't need to know technically all of this information. You just need to have a pretty good understanding of a lot of it. Which I know just sounds so fun. All right, let's jump right into it. It's the Great Compromise and the 3/5 Compromise. So, well, let's look at this, I guess. The Great Compromise basically set kind of the understanding of how many representatives from each state would be in the House of Representatives, how many representatives would be in the Senate. Good stuff like that. General, like, how is our government going to work? We have a constitution, yes, but now how are we going to do that from there? And then the 3/5 compromise is not a good compromise, but it does relate to the Great Compromise because the Great Compromise decided that you would get the number of representatives for the House of Representatives based off of your state population. And so, of course, the South said, wait. Like, most of our population is of slaves, and slaves aren't people. But we want to have a lot more representatives because that gives us a bigger say in Congress. So how do we make this work? And so then everybody else says, well, they can be worth 3/5 of a human. So the 3/5 compromise states that any slave counts as 3/5 of a person towards your state size, state population, and so that boosted the southern states population enough to make them happy, and also kept them at bay enough to make the North happy. You really can't make this up, folks. That's really sad. And then the slave trade compromise dealt with whether slaves could be sold, whether they could be taxed. I don't really have a very deep understanding of it. So I'm not going to go too in depth because I don't want to say anything wrong, especially in the way of slavery. But if you like learning about African American history, I would say this is a great topic that you could potentially talk about on your exam, to research on your own. So I did have a picture here for the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, but I couldn't find them. I do, however, have the Alien and Sedition Acts, or as it says here, the Alien and Sedition Laws. So let's talk about that very briefly, yeah? So the Alien and Sedition Acts are 4 acts passed in preparation for an expected war we thought we were going to have with France and then did not end up having. But they basically outline who is an alien or an outsider and who is a friend or an insider, or who lies in between and what can we do to them. The first of these acts is the Naturalization Act. So this says that immigrants must now wait 14 years instead of 5 years for citizenship and voting privileges. Ouch. The second says that is the Alien Enemies Act, and this says that the president can deport any alien from a country the U.S. is at war with without needing any really strong reason, basically. The Alien Friends Act says that the president can deport any alien that could be considered dangerous whether or not the United States was at war with the country. And the Sedition Act says that punishment of any person authoring or printing false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress or the president that defames them, they could be punished. So 4 kind of random acts, if you really think about it, but it basically changed the way citizenship worked for immigrants. It dealt with deportation of people who were dangerous or people who were from a country we were at war with, and then it deals with defaming the Constitution or defaming the government, basically. And then the Naturalization Law of 1802 said that every state and territorial court was district court within the laws pertaining to naturalization, and anyone naturalized there had the same rights as other courts. So aliens declare intention to be citizen. None of it makes sense to me either. I hate history. Have I said that? I hate history. Moving on. Let's talk briefly about protective tariffs. I don't have a whole lot of information. Again, we haven't really bumped into where I start having a whole lot of notes laid out here for us. But we could look at this comic I pulled up. So we have what looks to be, we're not doing this. It's tariffs, and unemployed labor can't get over the tariffs. Moving on. Manifest destiny. Yay. So we've all seen this picture, but I still put it up here because I thought to myself, what would we rather do with our lives? And look at this picture again. So here we are. We've got the pretty lady, and she's got the telegraph wire, and there's a train and settlers, and whoop-de-doo. So the first thing that I guess we could kind of talk about is generally the War of 1812, which we just don't mention in these key terms, is the War of 1812, because that's not important. Anyways, the War of 1812 had to do with tensions with the Native Americans who sided with Britain. So President James Madison felt the need to take out a Native American base in Canada. This caused this kind of begins to split the nation. So the South and the West support Republicans, whereas the North support the Federalist Democrats or whatever. And then the War of 1812 happened because James Madison wanted to restore confidence in the, quote, Republican experiment. Wow. It ended up showing the U.S. weaknesses that we were able to address, so we got better roads and better armies, and we gained world respect, and industrialization happened, and U.S. nationalism increased. This war was generally not very important, but also it just kind of caused the U.S. to puff our chests a little bit. Also in here was the Adams-Onis Treaty. James Monroe dealt with this, different guy, James Monroe. This was basically what I refer to as the Florida Purchase, where we got Florida from Spain. So imagine the Zelda sound effect, whatever. We acquired new land. Woohoo! We got Florida. Great. There's the Anglo-American Convention, which was signed in London. It ended the hostilities of the 1812 war. And then we've got just Manifest Destiny, which, if you don't know what Manifest Destiny is, that is basically the crappy American way of saying we own all the land. So basically it gave Americans the idea in their head that, good fish, it gave Americans the idea in their head that we could take over all the land west of us. So if we are on the East Coast, we can go all the way west. And that land is basically reserved for Americans. And so we see all of these people hightailing their little butts to get out west. There's gold out west, and they like gold. We've got this pretty angel lady blessing our journey, because it's just it's our destiny to go west, of course. At this point, James Monroe also helped to bring in the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that any country that tried to colonize nearby land counts as an act of aggression towards the United States. Again, another show of power. The Americans really enjoy their shows of power. And there was also an era of good feelings at this point. They began building national roads. Interstate commerce was beginning to be regulated. There was one party that was ruling. There was establishing strong nationalism for the whole country, not just individual states, which is something newer in American history at this point. But behind the scenes, this is when tensions really began to start rising. So let's see if there's anything else for the Manifest Destiny that I should hit. Oh, the Louisiana Purchase. Did I just run right past that? Or is this just still wildly out of order? I'm so sorry this is so disorganized. I really cannot help it. I swear to God. Well, if I see it in my notes, we'll talk about it, but I don't see it yet. Obviously, you can use your beautiful little brain there and figure out what happens when we acquire new land. Oregon, yay! Texas, yay! And then I'll talk about the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo later because it's on the list twice. So let's talk a little bit then about political parties. So, not to, toot my own horn here, but we are going to look at my timeline because I don't have anybody else's to look at. So, let's just go very briefly, not necessarily through the people. You have eyes, you can read about them if you want, but to go through the parties. So, the main two parties in the 1836 time-ish is the Whigs and the Democrats. The Democrats win. The Democrats stand for localism, freedom, states' rights, artisans, farmers, immigrants, Westerners, Southerners. Like, this is what we would consider to be the more conservative group, whereas the Whigs wanted gradual westward expansion. They were more focused on nationalism, modernism. North people, middle-class people made up this group, so they were what we would consider to be more liberal at the time. Then we tack on the Liberty Party at some point, and they are anti-slavery. They don't really like the Constitution. They hang around for a little while. They hang around for a little while. We keep going. They kind of fade out between 1844 and 1848. They, at some point, wanted the elimination of racial discrimination, but then they kind of went away and were somewhat replaced with the Free Soil Party. This was men from the Liberty Party. They were more strongly anti-slavery and anti-black that word. So they kind of took the ending ideals of the Liberty Party and sparked it again on the Free Soil Party. Again, we still have the Whigs and Democrats holding on strong. And at this point, the Whigs kind of disappear and are replaced with the American Party and the Republicans. The Republicans support in the North came out of the anti-Nebraska men, whereas the American Party were anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, ex-Whigs, wanted citizen-only voting, native-born officials, and longer naturalization. So remember how we talked about earlier how it went from 5 years to 14 years for citizenship? Yeah, they want that longer. Needless to say, they didn't stick around very long and were very quickly replaced by the Constitutional Union, who also pretty much faded out basically immediately, but that's beyond the point. And that party was anti-extremist, so the exact opposite. They absorbed Southern Whigs. Republicans were too radical for them, and so they kind of make up the other group. And then eventually we kind of made our way to Democrats and Republicans. But that's a little bit later down the line. So that kind of covers the political parties. Generally, the big thing they keep in mind is that the Whigs were there for a while, the Republicans were there for a while, the Free Soilers were there, the Liberty Party was there. They kind of turned into the Free Soil Party. It's all good. We talked about the platforms, generally, somewhat why they were formed. I'm going to skip over sectionalism because I don't feel like I have the notes or the understanding to really talk about it. Well, I have it right here next to me. I might as well say something about it. Sectionalism for the North meant that they were more focused. Oh, wait, this is really easy. So the North, it really begins to highlight the difference between the North and the South. The North were much more focused on economy because they had that industry, they had that strong industrial revolution already. They had more laborers, workers, blending cultures. They thought the Union took priority, so the country as a whole. And they supported these tariffs, whereas the South, they had an economy in the sense that they had agriculture, the cotton gin. Their laborers mostly came from slaves. They had antiquated, which means old, social orders. Slaves' rights were more important than country rights. They wanted nullification. They opposed those tariffs. So it really starts to break down at this point. And this is like generally even before 1819. Really starts to break down the divide between the North and the South, specifically, again, likely because of that, the slavery and what the economy looked like and how it was determined. Moving right along, the Missouri Compromise was done by Henry Clay, who was a great compromiser. He prohibits slavery in the Louisiana Territory, except Missouri. The South ended up agreeing to the Missouri Line. So, what does this mean? We're going to talk a lot about the Missouri Line or the Missouri Compromise. That's that 3630 line here. That's going to kind of start to separate when we get new territory. Where do we put slaves? Where do we not put slaves? For a while, we are going to use this 3630 line, or the line created in the Missouri Compromise, as our guideline. So we can see that before then, we had area up here that was slave, and area even farther up that was not. But that line, the implementation of that Missouri line, is going to start drawing the line. But the South ended up agreeing to this line because there's still a lot of unclaimed territory below the line. Like, if you keep drawing, there's going to be like, all of this down here is going to be slave, and like all of this up here is not. They liked that. But obviously the North ended up agreeing to it too because they liked having the South basically be in check, is my understanding of it. So then we move on to Turner's Rebellion. Sorry. Yeah. Then we move into Turner's Rebellion, which I don't have any real strong information on, other than I believe that was the guy It was just a massacre in Virginia, all right? People killed people, and it's a really bad comic of it. I don't specifically remember it very well. This is just a common theme at this point, is I don't remember it. I don't remember much of this. I hate history. Yeah, let's move on, because we're not getting anywhere with this. So, something to keep in mind, it's not an actual specific thing, but something to keep in mind is states' rights versus federal power. So, the nullification basically is going to refer to the states being able to put themselves above the federal government whenever they think that the federal government is going against the Constitution. So this is something that we eventually got rid of because it's dumb. But right now it still exists. And so it's going to lead to a power imbalance between, or what we would now think of as a power imbalance between the states and the federal government, because it places a lot more responsibility into the states' hands to determine whether they think the calls of the federal government is constitutional or not. So this is again going to be one example of how states' rights versus federal power kind of don't work out well together. So let's, again, go back in time, because it doesn't go in order, to the Tariff of Abominations. So at this point, South Carolina had already found issues with the economy. They'd had these issues, and the Tariff of Abominations really helped to make these issues worse. I don't have recorded what exactly this tariff did, but they called it the Tariff of Abominations because it helped planters who relied on foreign trade rather than slaves. They didn't like that. South Carolina didn't like that. At this point, we can mention John C. Calhoun. He was a vice president from South Carolina. His idea ended up being nullification. which again was the states having the right to reject unconstitutional federal policies. He wanted to quote unquote protect states' rights, but it actually really just helped the white South because they were able to say, no, we don't believe in any of that crap. It's not constitutional, and get away with a lot more. So that does bring us to the nullification crisis. It was a revision of the Tariff of 1828, which put a really high tax on some imported goods and imported raw materials. It was meant to harm the South. At this point, this causes South Carolina to threaten secession already, because they blamed their bad economy on tariffs, and they thought they were being drowned out because of the North. So this led to the nullification crisis when they ended up having to revise the tariff 4 years after passing it, but South Carolina votes to nullify the law anyways. Andrew Jackson, who's the president at the time, takes this as an act of treason and sends a battleship to South Carolina. So what's a better way we can think of this, right? Like, that's always the question here, is what is an easier way we can go about thinking of this? Well, the easiest way is that the South, specifically South Carolina, took the Tariff of 1828 as a threat. And they believed that they were more or less being kicked out of the Union or drowned out of the Union from this abomination that was smothering their economy. And so they threatened to secede and ended up nullifying the law, which means counting it as unconstitutional and not using it in the government in the state, which then ended up in a revision of this tariff 4 years later. A battleship being sent to them, and Clay's Compromise. And Clay's Compromise is the compromise to gradually lower tariffs as long as South Carolina repeals their nullification, which they do, obviously. But this does force the divide between the North and the South to grow a little bit more. Congress authorizes the president to have power to use the military because obviously Andrew Jackson did that. He didn't necessarily have the power to do that at that point, but he did it anyways. But they made that a law that he could do that. He or she, if there was ever a woman president, you know. Anyways, so the spoils system is something created by Andrew Jackson. The spoils system basically helps people who help him. So it's spoiling those who are this is John C. Calhoun, by the way. If you wanted a picture to the face, this was the guy who came up with the nullification idea. Yeah, that's the guy. Anyways, very briefly, let's look at this nullification cartoon. Basically, it's just kind of showing the greediness that they had seen. England is looking in, and the states are kind of falling apart, and South Carolina's up here just being themselves. So funny. So this picture kind of takes a look at the spoil system. So again, Andrew Jackson came up with the spoil system. He spoils those who help him. We can see that this is kind of, in a way, a political cartoon in of itself, because we can see the pig and the money, and they're eating, and it's really quite gross that he's taking from people who don't help him and giving it to people who did. He also was the same person who did the Indian Removal Act, which would he wanted it to open 25 million acres of land for white people settlement because there was Georgian gold, but it did force Native Americans to move west, and it was like it ended up happening, like it ended up influencing the Trail of Tears that ended up causing that, which was like 4,000 deaths on a 1,000-mile march. So not a good situation during winter of all times. This happened before the Tariff of 1828, which is why I don't appreciate the order that we've gone in. Anyways, a spoil system, right? So then we're going to talk about abolitionism. This is something that I do feel confident enough to talk about. So, this is Frederick Douglass. Say hi, Frederick Douglass. He's an abolitionist. I'm not going to mention his name again. So there are 4 types of abolitionists. There are the Garrisonians, the political abolitionists, the military abolitionists, and the religious abolitionists. So really, they're all going to be pretty self-explanatory except for the Garrisonians. So let's hit them first, and then we'll cycle back and hit them again. The Garrisonians wanted slavery to end without string attached. They were nonviolent. They attacked state, military, and churches. So they were like all-around deal. Like they hit every part of every group. They were nonviolent. I believe that they were interested in having women partner up with them. Like these guys were like, we want slavery to be done. We want no strings attached. We want it to happen now. Let's talk to everybody we can and get this done, right? So then we have the political abolitionists who wanted to legally change the laws. So they went through the political side of things. They tried to get people in the government to oppose slavery and change the laws to end slavery. The military abolitionists are also called the radical abolitionists. These guys were just crazy. They were violent. They attacked pro-slavery settlers. Like these guys said, you see what the Garrisonians are doing? Well, what if we didn't do that? And so they were just insane instead and just hurt people to try and get their point across. And then finally we have the religious abolitionists. They thought that slavery was a sin, so they used the Bible and God to call for the end of slavery. They were like Quakers were included in them. They opposed the slave trade. But again, the Garrisonians are all around nonviolent, peaceful group of abolitionists. So then we have the Southern justification of slavery. And this is honestly, to be quite honest, pretty self-explanatory in that it's talked about a lot. They think that whites are the superior race, that African Americans weren't human, they were property. They needed the African Americans to fuel their economy, to be honest. And it's really sad, but that's just how they let life happen. And it just stayed that way. It was really sad. So, somewhere in there, we have the Texas War for Independence. Because of course we do. Here, we can look at this picture. So the Texas War for Independence happens when Mexico closes its border to the U.S. through Texas, right? So U.S. settlers are refusing to pay property taxes. There's issues over emancipation. Then this all sparks the Texas War for Independence in 1836. The U.S. government supports Texas but doesn't really want to get involved, and then the Texans end up defeating the Mexicans in 1836. Texas remains independent. They didn't like government oversight very much. This is actually the reason why Texas is just screwed over every time anything ever happens that's bad to them, because they were very against government oversight, and so they're like not connected to the main power grid, and they don't have the same supports that they kind of should have. So in the case of the blizzard that happened last year, they got screwed over pretty good because of it. Things like that. This is why the British seeks the British wants an independent Texas because they want more conflict between the U.S. and Mexico. And there are a little bit of tensions between U.S. and Mexico sparking at this point because of the Texas War for Independence. Mexico doesn't really see Texas as independent, and they kind of blame the U.S. for the war. So although the U.S. was really not getting into the war, Mexico still blames the U.S. And so as a result, the U.S. approach is to settle in Mexico territory, and this obviously causes tensions to rise between them. So then we have the Mexican-American War. So the Mexican-American War is obviously a war between Mexico and America. I think you can figure that one out yourself there, Chief. This is basically a war for manifest destiny, right? We have this guy, this president, James K. Polk, who I hate because he's so annoying. He just starts this war over basically nothing because he likes manifest destiny. Like, if you can remember anything about James K. Polk, remember that he is a terrible name and that he does everything just because he likes manifest destiny and he thinks the U.S. is the best, and so he decides that we have to go to war against Mexico because we are better. He wants California. He tries to buy it, but Mexico says, no, you can't have that. But Polk thinks we have manifest destiny. That's our right to own California. And so he starts a war. Now, this is the Mexican-American War. This is kind of when Lincoln starts to emerge from the depths of the world. He's a representative from Illinois. He starts to question the events leading to the war. He starts to question constitutionality leading up to the war. Anti-slavery groups at this point oppose the war because slave states would be added. Anti-slavery groups or abolitionist groups, they don't want more war, and they don't want more land coming in below that Missouri Compromise line because that would result in more slaves. And more slaves basically means less free states, which is bad. And there's also kind of the situation where the Northerners see this as a very Southern war. Like, James K. Polk is more of a Southern guy, and the war is in the South, and it's like kind of over Texas, kind of not, which the U.S. doesn't really have any hand in. And they don't really want more slaves. The North is like not happy that they have to pay for this war, in part, right? And then it does end up leading to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This, obviously, the United States is going to win because we win everything. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo results in the acquisition of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, California, Utah. There's a new border, and we decided, like, let's stop here because it would be too much work, basically, to get the rest of Mexico. So we said, okay, Mexico, we patted them on the head, you can keep the rest of your land, but we're going to take this. And so we did, because we're America, and we do whatever we want. Anyways, this kind of has a lasting long-term impact because this land is the basis for the Civil War. It sparks kind of a more in-depth discussion because as we gain more land, and it's not necessarily all under that Missouri line, we kind of have this conversation of, well, what do we do with it? What do we do with all this new land? And that question comes up over and over and over again, and it's kind of the basis for what we could consider the Civil War. If we didn't acquire this land, if we didn't have stupid Polk who got all this land from Mexico because, quote unquote, we deserve it. He didn't say that. That's me being funny. We deserve it. We probably wouldn't have very in-depth discussions about slavery in that part of the United States. So, the Wilmot Proviso, abolitionists perceive war as provoked by the Southern slave interests. So they see the previous war as being a Southern slave interest war. They wanted to ban slavery in any... The Wilmot Proviso is a proposed law that would ban slavery in any territory from Mexico. Side note, Abraham Lincoln does support this, but the Southerners do not because they don't like that, and so therefore it's blocked in Congress. And there is the Cass Compromise, and the Cass Compromise just says that citizens should decide by popular vote or popular sovereignty if they want to be a slave state or not. So this is kind of, again, the basis for what we could consider the Civil War to be, because we said, yeah, just let them pick, and then that didn't go well. Right, great. So let's talk about the compromise of, well, we could talk a little bit about the gold rush if we wanted to. There's gold. California wants to be a state. The South doesn't like that, so they threaten secession. I was going to say take a shot. Please don't take a shot. You're in high school. Do an extra hour of studying every time I say that someone threatens secession, because you would not have enough time in the day. South threatens secession because California as a free state would give free states an advantage in the House and the Senate, and they would be fearful over the abolishment of slavery, and so they need a compromise. And so then they come up with the Compromise of 1850. Our good old friend Henry Clay is back. He was there for the Missouri Compromise too, if you recall. And he comes up with these provisions, basically. That would be the Compromise of 1850. By the way, we haven't talked about this, but just as like a side note, we did see this in class where we have Kansas, and we'll get there. But it is kind of interesting to think about while we talk about this. So you can look at this while I do this. So basically what this compromise does is it has several effects. California comes in as a free state. There's no more domestic slave trade in Washington, D.C. Congress can't interfere with slave trade where it already exists. The territory the rest of the territory is open to slavery through popular sovereignty. And Congress will pass a law that assists with the recovery of runaway slaves. So there are basically three parts. There are four parts to this, right? And California being free and no more domestic slave trade in D.C. is for the North. And then no more Congress interference with slave trade where it exists. Popular sovereignty and runaway slaves are all more on the South side. Though you could argue that popular sovereignty kind of agreed with everyone, right? But neither of them actually end up enjoying this because the South doesn't like having to give up California, and the North doesn't like to concede on basically the rest of their points. So we have this Fugitive Slave Act going on, right? Where if there is a slave in any state, including the North, they could be fined. Basically, they have to be taken back. If there's a federal official who lets a slave get away, they can be fined for up to $1,000, which at that point is like a crap ton of money, right? If you see an African American and you don't know if they're a slave or not, like anybody could raise their hand and be like, yeah, they're a slave, and then everybody would just be like, oh, okay, they're a slave. They couldn't testify for themselves to be like, no, I'm not. Anybody aiding, like, this is just like, if you are a fugitive slave, they just crack down, and it's like, even judges are basically, their pay doubles for any time they say that an African American is a slave versus not a slave. It's $10 instead of $5. So there's all these things stacking up against the North for the Fugitive Slave Act. There were people in the North who were potentially aiding runaway slaves who went to the North for safety, but there was chaos there now because people were turning against each other. There was mistaken identity, monetarily driven actions. There was corruption now, which we hadn't really been seeing as much in the North before because we were all not necessarily on the same side, but we had no reason to like get up in each other's business. But now there's money at stake, and now we do have a reason to get up all in each other's business. And the South is happy because this Slave Act basically gives them a whole bunch of slaves back that they would have lost otherwise. So that brings us to like this growing abolitionism situation that we've got going on, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act. We talked about that. The Kansas-Nebraska Act basically divides this Nebraska territory into two territories, Nebraska and Kansas, where one is slave and one is free. And they would be decided which is which based on popular sovereignty. This kind of ends the Missouri Compromise because of where the states fall on the map. They were a big chunk of that Missouri line. And so the fact that they're now able to decide for their lonesome whether or not they want to be slave states really ends that Missouri Compromise that we had going on. States are really expected more to decide on their own whether or not they'd like to be slavery positive or not. And so as a result, it's just unnecessary to have the Missouri Compromise. There's opposition in the North. It hurts the pro-slave South. It's just like nothing's going well anymore, you know? Like things were like not great, but they weren't terrible. And then when you thought it couldn't get any worse, we have Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas happens because of the territorial election of 1855. There are border ruffians who came from other states that were very violent to those who opposed their beliefs. There's just a lot of violence. There's anti-slavery towns being sacked, and there's territorial civil war erupting at this point. Kansas is applying for statehood, but anti-slave forces are boycotting this election. Pro-slavery forces end up coming out on top. Nothing is solved. It's just Bleeding Kansas and everything is going wrong, right? So the election of 1856 and the Lecompton Constitution kind of come in together. James Buchanan wins the election. James Buchanan, he's a Democrat who at this point is the pro-slavery side, right? Because a pro-Southerner wins, the Lecompton Constitution is supported, which means that there's an action split, and Stephen Douglas has to intervene, who's like the champion of popular sovereignty. He blocks this constitution, and there's a lot more division in the Democratic Party along these sectional lines. Canada remains a territory. It doesn't really get to be a state now until 1861. It's just not good. Like, bad things are happening. And then we also have the Brooks-Sumner affair, who we can see on the list of names. Brooks and Sumner are on here somewhere, I'm sure. Or Brooks and Sumner. These names are not in order. And basically what happens there is nothing good. Because what ends up happening is a big fight in Congress, like physical violence in Congress. And there's a fight between these two in response to the crime against Kansas, which is basically bleeding Kansas. And the significance is that there's a bloodbath, even in Congress. Everywhere is bloody. There's foreshadowing going on as to what's going to happen to the actual states. And then we get to the Dred Scott versus Sanford situation, where the Congress basically says that because African Americans aren't citizens, they can't sue in a federal court. And so it really shuts down at a federal level the fact that African Americans are not citizens. This kind of leads us into Harpers Ferry, which is known as the point of no return. And we've got this picture here. At the bottom it says a premature movement. John Brown says, "Here, take this and follow me. My name's Brown." And the guy says, "Please God, Mr. Brown, that is impossible. You haven't done anything to our house," basically, more or less. Harper's Ferry, you could go either way, if you love it or hate it, but it was bloody. Lots of things are bloody at this point. John Brown, most generic name ever. John Brown wanted to free slaves and encourage other people to escape, and so he took hostages. He was violent. He basically said, "All right, let's fight our way out of this situation," and it didn't work, and everybody died instead. And this fuels the need for secession for the South. And then we have the beginning, really, we have this election of 1860. Lincoln and Douglas have their famous debates. There are 7 of them, which Lincoln ends up formally losing, but also kind of winning. There's a Freeport doctrine and the Freeport question that are brought up, and it's, could the people of a territory lawfully exclude slavery without it being explicitly stated in the Constitution? So there's a lot of questions on what counts as being explicit in the Constitution, and what are the rights of the people, and what are the rights of the states. There's a lot to consider with it. And then you have the Union-Confederacy split now. We've got the Union, who's mostly the North, and the Confederacy, which is mostly the South. And they really, at this point, split. At this point, Lincoln has won the War of 1860. The election of 1860, it very well could have been a war. And this kind of throws us right into the Civil War. So now we're civil warring, and we have this Anaconda Plan. And that's the Union's plan to basically circle around the Confederacy or the South and just squeeze like an anaconda. That was their grand plan. You can't make this stuff up. There's strengths and weaknesses to both sides. The Union has telegrams and railroads, and the Confederacy has none. The Confederacy really doesn't have a very strong central government. They are trying to create a whole new government, whereas the Union already has one that's pretty established. But the Union is at a disadvantage because they're trying to take over. They're trying to take back over the land that the South has already kind of claimed and is settled in, whereas the South is merely trying to defend their land, so that puts them at an advantage. And at this point, it's just a war. So there are technological advances. We have the mini ball, we have the telegram, we have the railroads, we have, there's a bug on my wall. It's not a big bug though, it's fine. This is what happens. But we've got all these technological situations happening, going on, right? And these advancements, basically, specifically with the mini ball and the guns that are made, we've progressed so fast, so quickly, but we aren't able to keep up with ourselves. And so as a result, the tactics don't change, but the technology does. And why, you might be wondering to yourself, why is this important? Well, it results in up to 700,000 casualties for the whole thing. Like, that's a lot of people dead, and really fast. So, kind of moving past the political, social, and economic causes of the Civil War, because I feel like we've kind of gone into them. I can go into them a little bit more. Political is obviously going to be the fact that the South feels like they're just being, like, bonked over the head, and the North feels like you can't just leave. Socially, we've got now, once the Emancipation Proclamation happens, it's a moral war for slavery versus no slavery. And then economically, the South feels the need to defend their plantations because that's their economy. And the North feels the need to not do that because they've got their industry. Lincoln versus Davis, I'm just going to run right over. I don't have too many notes on them. I mean, I have a little bit. Jefferson Davis, there was just a constant turnover in the cabinet. There was not a great communicating situation there. He defies public opinion. So again, he's that like not good leader. He's not very decisive. He doesn't make a lot of good decisions or really any decisions. He doesn't communicate very well. Basically, he just replaces his whole crew like constantly. Whereas Lincoln is very shrewd. He plays his cards very well. He makes friends with his political enemies within the Union. He takes people into his cabinet who he would normally disagree with because he sees it as an advantage. Because if you're able to get along with someone you disagree with, then you can learn from them and better yourself and your situation. He does a lot of very political tactics. He suspends the writ of habeas corpus, so he can detain suspects now. There's martial law happening. He censors newspapers at some point, but he also is like, he makes friends with a lot of these newspapers. And then we've got the role of foreign nations. So the Britain is basically running out of cotton. And so that's kind of like putting them on the edge to like maybe side with the South because they kind of want their cotton. And Europe is like, well, we kind of also want to side with the South. But then once the Battle of Gettysburg happens, they both kind of go, never mind then. I'm not going to do that anymore. So they almost played a really big role in the war and then ended up not doing so. The border states are specifically referring to the states that are on the border. So Maryland or Delaware. Hold on, I have a list. Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware. These four states are called border states. They are the states that don't really fall into the Union or the Confederacy, and they play a really big role specifically for the Union because if the Union can keep them on their side, then that gives them a really big advantage of not having to fight the Confederacy over them. So Maryland was the way that Lincoln kind of kept them on his side, maintaining loyalty in Maryland is through martial law and habeas corpus, and in Missouri is through sending Union troops Kentucky and Delaware were never really super big, like, concerns because Delaware was always Union loyal. They were only ever really 2% slaves. And Kentucky kind of likes their neutrality. I'm guessing after seeing Bleeding Kansas or whatever, they've already gone through the Kentucky-Nebraska situation, so they wanted to keep their neutrality. All right, so let's talk about the war. And then once we're done, it'll be the end. Once we get here, we're almost done. We are so close. So Fort Sumter. Let's just go into, like, Zoom mode because I really want to get this done and not have to do this anymore. Fort Sumter. Basically, this is the beginning of the battle. Picture, we are like, tensions are high and everybody's like tiptoeing around each other. Lincoln doesn't want to start the battle because he doesn't want to be the bad guy, and so he doesn't. He instead has a blockade, and he brings in support through the means of like food and weapons and whatever, but he doesn't bring in people because he doesn't want to be the instigator here. So as a result, when the Confederates have seized those forts, they end up firing first. And there's a blockade going on, trying to get, once Lincoln puts in this blockade, it leads to basically the rest of the southern states seceding and joining this like situation. The Union loses here, but even though they lose, they build support in the North to go along with the war. So at this point, there wasn't really a big case in the North to go for the war. But because the Union is able to prove through this battle that war is important. And so they end up going along with it. Also, if you were wondering, I just killed that bug. That was right there. All right, moving on. Whew! We did Fort Sumter. What's next? First Battle of Bull Run. First Battle of Bull Run, or the first It's the first major battle. It's a Confederate victory. It stops the Union. This is kind of when we realize that it's going to be a very bloody battle, and Lincoln ends up calling for more enlistment, and they get their new strategy of the Anaconda Plan. Then we have Shiloh. Right? Yeah. Then we have Shiloh. There are skirmishes before the battle begins. There are many smaller surprise attacks on one another. It ends up being a win for the Union. It's a Western Front battle. It's the first one. There's supply troubles for the South, and that's beginning to really show up. Moving right along. The Battle of the Ironclads. This is a modern war. It has ironclad ships. They repel the bullets. And this was really the time when we made wooden ships obsolete. Moving along. Antietam. Antietam was super bloody. It was like kind of crazy. It ends up being the reason why Abraham Lincoln is able to do the Emancipation Proclamation. It ends in a standstill, really, but because Lee and the Confederacy ends up retreating, it doesn't matter that it ends up in a standstill because they win. The Union wins in heart, and so the Emancipation Proclamation happens. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in states that were not the border states. They didn't want to upset the border states. They didn't do it in the border states. But everywhere else, he freed the slaves, and that really ticked the Southerners off. But it changed the war from a war over the South to a war over slavery. It turned it into a moral war, and it gave the Union a real reason to fight. So it was a really, really important proclamation to be had. And he didn't tell anybody he was working on this. He just did it. So then we had Gettysburg. Gettysburg happened. It happened alongside Vicksburg. They really had the same reasons that they were important. Number one, this discouraged Europe from helping the Southerners. Number two, it boosted morale for the Union. Number three, it stopped Confederate movements. They were no longer able to move. It also caused the Gettysburg Address to happen. Then, finally, in New York City, there were draft riots. These draft riots happened because New York City didn't want more drafts to happen, and so it got really, really violent. And then basically that violence just kind of stopped because everybody said, why are we doing this? I don't know. And so they didn't do it anymore. Total war happens. It's crazy. Everybody is going wild. Finally, Sherman's March to the Sea. This is basically what ends up kind of ending the war. Not officially, but more or less. Sherman's March to the Sea, it's just like violent and everybody goes crazy and ends up terrorizing Georgia. Georgia ends up abandoning the Confederacy. Great. This is like the beginning of the end. Eventually, the Confederates surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865. Great. Now the war is over. Lee surrenders to Grant, ending the Civil War. That's it today, folks. This was too long. I don't like history. If you have questions, feel free to leave them in the description. I will answer them. If you don't want to leave them in the description, either text them to me or message them to me on Discord. That's all she wrote. Bye. Oh, I'm not talking about Reconstruction. We haven't talked about that yet. Yeah, bye for real now.